Welcome everybody to session 7 of our Tough Topics Digital Conference, and we're excited to be back for 2 more nights here. As I do every night, as we're getting started here, I want to remind you just a little bit about what the purpose of this conference is. We want to engage in conversations that are difficult sometimes to have in a church context, and we want to hear from someone with some expertise and some experience that we just don't have on a specific topic. Keep in mind that this isn't a debate. We're not here to push a certain agenda forward. We're not here to correct this person on anything they share, even if we disagree. You might disagree with something, we might disagree with something, and that's okay. We'll have time to unpack this and to learn from it, but for tonight, our main goal is to ask questions and to listen. With that, we also want to remind you that we've done a lot of content over these 2 weeks, but if you're feeling kind of overwhelmed or like, it's content overload, we'll have plenty of time to go through it together over the coming weeks and months. So don't feel pressure to absorb everything and apply it to your life in right now. That's not how we're going to approach this. So we will have a lot of time with it moving forward, and we're excited to get into that more. One last thing, if you have questions as you're following along on YouTube as we stream live, you can text those questions to 262-757-8588. And if we see it in time, we will make sure to ask that question as well. With that, I'm going to pass over to John.
All right, thanks, John. Our guest for today is Dr. Kristin Lindholm. She is the Associate Professor of Communication and Chair of the Communications Department. She's been teaching at Trinity International University, my alma mater, since 1994. She earned her PhD at the University of Illinois in Urbana, specializing in health communication. Dr. Lindholm teaches courses in subjects such as family and gender communication, mass communication, and communication theory. She has published research in the areas of health and end-of-life communication, and she is currently working on a book about how parents can guide their children's approach to mass media. Dr. Lindholm has received the President's Prize for Excellence in Teaching at TIU in 2014, the Regents Prize for Distinguished Performance at TIU in 2009, and the Teacher of the Year for the College of Arts and Sciences at TAU for the 1997-98 academic year. Dr. Lindholm, thanks for joining us.
My pleasure. It's exciting to be here, and I'm excited to talk about such an important topic.
Absolutely. Before we even get started, I just want to say Savannah and I had speech with Dr. Lindholm, and we regularly talk about our time in her class and how much we enjoyed it, and how she had such an impact on our lives. So thank you so much for that. And maybe not so much thank you, but Savannah often reminds me after a sermon when I'm not following what you taught us. So thank you and no thank you, I suppose.
Oh, fair enough.
So first and foremost, can you tell us a little bit about the book that you're working on? I think that'll be interesting for a lot of our listeners.
Absolutely. So I've been teaching an introductory class to mass media since 2000. And I ended up going to graduate school shortly after I started teaching in that area. And I had no idea while I was working on my degree that the whole communication field was changing. Because while I was working on my degree, 2004 came, and any of you know that, that's when Facebook starts. And so we've had these massive changes that have happened with Facebook and Instagram and YouTube. The smartphone, believe it or not, doesn't become a mass medium until right around 2010. So I was watching communication shift on me while I was studying it. So that kind of got my attention. And then I had a child and was watching what I was teaching show up in my own home. So I would talk about how difficult it was to get children off screens, and then I'd come home and I'd have difficulty getting my son off a screen. Or I'd talk about, wow, this is affecting our posture, it's affecting our eyesight, and I'd come home and I'd see him hunched over his machine, exactly what I'd just been teaching about. So the longer I was doing this and the more I was interacting with parents, the more I realized I was not alone. I just had more information about it, and I studied it, and that gave me greater resolve to parent in a different way. So several people said, you should write a book about this. And so eventually I took them up on it. And that's what I'm working on right now, is a book on parenting and the media.
That's awesome. So whenever you get that finished, you have to send it to me and I can put it out there, because I think there's a lot of people asking those same questions. So thank you for undertaking this and for working on such an important topic. Okay, so big picture, can you kind of lay out just the landscape of mass media today? You kind of talked about it a little bit as you were studying, Facebook came along, and then the cell phone and all of this stuff. So, or smartphones, I should say. Can you kind of just lay out the big picture of it, how it all works, who controls which networks, like how the money game works, all of this stuff?
Absolutely. And I love the fact that you're bringing up money, because I think that's one of the things that people don't think about enough. I always stress in my class that if you want to know how media works, follow the money. And that's going to help you understand it, because at its core, it is a money-making business. Yes, it does some good, but at its core, it is designed to make money. So if we wonder about, wow, why am I still watching this show on Netflix when I should have been in bed 2 hours ago? There's a part of the answer is that media is designed to keep us on it. They don't make money by us turning off our devices. They don't make money by us saying, gee, I should get out and take a walk instead of playing this game one more half hour. They make money by keeping us on media. So there's a reason why it is so addictive. I think if we think about it as a money-making venture, it's going to help us understand the pull it has for all ages, but especially for children and for teens. And we are doing a grand and glorious experiment on ourselves right now, because my childhood growing up was vastly different than my son's childhood. And in fact, if your childhood predates 2010, your childhood was vastly different than the people who've been growing up where the smartphone has always been part. I asked my college students this year, when did they first get a cell phone? And most of them said junior high, high school. If you look at the data now, it's pushed down into early elementary is when a lot of kids are getting their first smartphone. So one is to know just how fast it's changing, how pervasive it is. A lot of schools are giving out their own Chromebooks and their own iPads. And so it's becoming this integral part of childhood today. And so we don't fully know what that's going to yield, because we don't have enough data on it yet. So that's one piece of it. So about the money. When we think about the money, we think about it in 3 ways. You can get money directly, you can get money indirectly, and you can do both. So let me just unpack that, because it's really important. So first of all, direct. If I go, and let's imagine I can go to like a Barnes & Noble, and I go in and I walk in and I buy a book and I buy with cash, I have bought that book and no advertising comes with it. And if it is cash, they can't even track who I am. Okay? That's direct payment. I pay for the media. Indirect payment is what much of the internet does. I don't pay to watch a YouTube video. I don't pay to go to a website, but that's because they are selling me. So that's the way it works, is either you go and buy the product or you are the product. And they're collecting all sorts of data about you and selling it very specifically to advertisers. So anytime you see free media, please remember that you are the product and you are what's being sold. Some mediums do both. They're like, hey, let's get direct and let's get indirect. So if you do cable television, for example, you pay for that, but then you also get advertising along with it. Newspapers and magazines work off the same basic principle. So those are pretty crucial. And I think if I can get across to people that you are being sold in much of the cases, people's understanding of media will broaden, and you'll get a better sense, and also a better sense of what you want to be sold and what you do not want to be sold. Another big question that you ask about is who owns things. And much of media operates like an oligopoly. That's a big word that a lot of my students don't know what it is until they come into a mass media class. It means there isn't one monopoly, there's not one group, but there's a very small number of companies that really control the vast majority of our media. So I think about them in 3 big clumps. I think about the technology companies, so that's Microsoft, that's Apple, that's Amazon. They're kind of the big fish in the pond. You have your tech people, then you have your Facebook and all of your social media that are big. If you're not familiar with it, a lot of the biggest social media are in China. So Tencent, for example, would be a big piece of that. And then your next group is your media providers. So think AT&T, Warner, think Disney, think Comcast. And if those are names you're like, okay, Disney I get, but Comcast and AT&T, Warner, well, they own different things. So AT&T, Warner owns CNN. So if you're watching CNN, you are watching something that's owned by AT&T, Warner Media. If you're watching ABC, you're watching something that's owned by Disney. If you're watching Fox, it's owned by Fox. And if you're watching CBS, it's owned by CBS. So those are kind of the big players. When you look about these big media companies, they own a lot. So I had a list prepared just so you could get a sense of it. So AT&T Warner owns Warner Brothers, New Line Cinema, Turner Entertainment, Cinemax, Time, Sports Illustrated, People, Mad Magazine, Entertainment Weekly, Essence, the DC Universe. They own NBA.com, WNBA.com, Hanna-Barbera. You get a sense. So a lot of times we see these different labels and we think it's different companies, but they're all owned primarily by these big companies like AT&T, Warner, like Comcast. Anything with Universal, anything with NBC is Comcast, for example. So that can be really eye-opening for people to realize, oh, I thought I was getting a lot of different media companies, but really they're owned by very few big parent companies, and the majority of them are from the US.
You mentioned about how anything that's free that we kind of consume online is we're being sold. So like, what are some of the ways that media companies sell us, so to speak?
Many of you are aware, if you're not, this is a great thing to learn about, is that especially anytime you're on social media and you are liking something, or you're connecting on something, or you're clicking on an ad of any sort, or clicking on an article, that all of that is being recorded, and people are getting sold very specifically. So things like, I want somebody who is male in their 30s who's interested in this. That's how specific it gets. You can do a little experiment if you want. All you need to do is on social media, do a post of some sort, and then have a topic area or have a product in it, and then watch what happens to the advertising that you get. So for example, earlier on when I didn't understand all of this as much, I was looking for a plumber. So I just posted, anybody know a plumber? And a couple of my friends responded and I got a good plumber. But then a couple days later in my mailbox, I got a little letter from a local plumber saying, I understand you're looking for plumbing services, here's 20% off. And for me, that was a little bit of a creepy moment because I was like, okay, how do you know I'm looking for a plumber? Well, the answer was really easy, social media. So yes, you can do a lot of controls, but I think it's really wise to read carefully to understand how those things are being used. Often they are tracking you even when you are not on the social media. So for example, for Facebook, if Facebook is connected to a business, even if you're not on Facebook, it's still sending messages back to Facebook, would be an example of how that works. Another thing you can do is if your phone is on, talk about a product with your phone near you and see what happens. So a lot of my students have found that too. And the first time it happens to them, they're like, what? And then we talk a little bit about it, that, unless you are careful with your settings, yeah, is your phone listening to you? Yes, it is.
So from your understanding currently, is there a lot of regulation around that? Or is there any sort of like, where could this be heading is kind of where my mind goes first. Like, what are some of the warnings that people are kind of putting out there about this data gathering and information?
I think for the big answer to me is there's not enough out there, because especially younger people. So my son and I were talking once, they kept asking him, how old he was. And, a lot of my students were like, well, yeah, you have to be at least 13 to get on to Facebook. And I asked them, why do you think that is? And they said, well, because they want kids to be mature enough. I said, no, because 13 is when they can start tracking you. So again, you always have to think about money. And so often when they're asking about age, they want to know legally, when can we begin tracking that person? And we're already creating these profiles at very young ages. And sometimes parents are doing it for their kids by posting a lot of stuff about their kids already. All of that stuff, if it's public, that's usable. So a lot of times, again, I think we don't know enough about what's happening. There's been some recent developments with Facebook that allow you to go in and to unselect some pieces of that. So I do recommend, if people haven't done that, to really read a bit about it and figure out. Facebook's one of the biggest users of this kind of information. They're certainly not alone, but one of the biggest ones.
Interesting. So while we're on social media, what is social media interaction? How has that kind of changed the game of communication in general? And what is it doing to like face-to-face communication? I know this is a topic that comes up a lot, but in your professional opinion.
So social media, I think, does two things. I think one set of positive, one not so good. So one of the things I think that's really positive about social media is that we can connect with people we haven't connected with for a while. We can connect with people overseas very easily. We can connect with people, perhaps we've got a health condition that's pretty rare, or we have something going on with a child and nobody around us has that. We can create these virtual communities that can be wonderful. Sometimes social media can really give us a sense of new causes we hadn't thought about, or people can band together to support good things. So I want to make it really clear that I don't think social media is bad in and of itself. It's just how we use it, and it's also how the companies that run it use it. Both of those are big factors. From my perspective as someone who studies it, one of the biggest things with social media is how much time we spend on it. And actually the research about social media suggests if people spend 30 minutes or less, they're not going to have a lot of the major negative things that come from social media. It's usually the more hours people are spending on it. And the evidence is out there that people are often spending 2+ hours a day on it. You're going to start to get into more negative impacts. So among those negative impacts, a number of them, one would be the opportunity for cyberbullying, especially for younger people, for teens, for kids. But even for older people, it can be things like fear of missing out. So a sense of anxiety when I'm not on social media. What am I missing out on? One of the biggest ones is comparison with other people's lives. Because almost everybody who uses social media, the vast majority, they try to make their life look pretty good. And so, it's my fun things, and look at this great shot, and here's my selfie that I took 5 of them until I got one I liked. So we're comparing our lives against these, what they call them, carefully curated lives. And so people can end up with lower self-esteem, they can end up with envy, they can end up feeling like their life is not measuring up. And so that's been a effect we're really watching. The effects tend to be a little higher and worse for women than they are for men on social media, and especially for teenage girls. So a really important area to watch.
Yeah. Absolutely. So what is that as a professor at a Christian college too? So like what are some of the implications of that like carefully curated image for us spiritually?
I think that's a great question. And one of the things I like to think about it is in terms of audience. So how often during your day are you thinking about how somebody else might view this? So in other words, that would be a great picture for me to post for people to view. So are we enjoying, for example, a moment with our child, or are we thinking, I got to get the right picture of that so I can post it? So anytime we're starting to think about our audience and how we look to that audience, it's not good for our spiritual life. We're not meant to perform for other people and to see how many likes we can get or how many responses we can get. I think that's spiritually dangerous for us. I like to think about living our lives with God as our main audience. And so as soon as we get into that mindset of, I got to think about these other audiences and how they're going to respond, I think we get into a dangerous place. One of the big things that Jesus really got to the Pharisees about and the Sadducees was you're performing. This is performance, doing the big prayers for other people, fasting and looking like you're fasting. It's not about God, it's about other people. And you got your reward in full, because that's not how we're supposed to be living, and that's not whose approval we're supposed to be going after.
That's really good. So, okay, let's switch gears just a little bit. There's a lot of talk out there about media bias. You mentioned they're owned by a few companies. Fake news has become a term. And these are regular comments that people hear and people get really, really fired up about today. So how do we, in this landscape and atmosphere, how do we go about consuming information? And to throw on top of all of that, the marketing and of you being sold, the selling point, right? So all of this stuff, how do we go about consuming information, getting to the truth of information?
You're asking such an important question. Number one, media is biased. let's just go there. Because it's created by people. So for example, let's take our average television broadcast. So some of us are old enough to remember television broadcast news. It's still out there, but a lot of people get their news different ways. But if you remember, or if you watch television broadcasts, you'll see at the beginning the crime. There's, here's all the bad things going on. And then here's what's going on in politics. And here's what's going on locally in politics and locally with crime. And here's our weather segment, and here's our sports. Who decided that was news? People did. So why is it so negative? Why? And there is a negative bias toward news. Why is it so conflict oriented? Why is it Republicans versus Democrats, or these people versus this? Why is it two when we know that a lot of times there's a lot more viewpoints than two that make up a segment. So when we think about, especially how news is presented to us, we start to believe this is the way news is, even though these are man-made creations, human-made creations, is that it's going to be two-sided, and then it's going to be conflict-oriented, and it's going to be negative, and we're going to have a lot of crime and a lot of politics, as opposed to reporting on, here's some great things people are doing. Here's some innovations that are coming out. Here's the newest research that's happening in this. We have made a decision, often as the news media, to create things in a certain way. And we end up with a product that people recognize, but it becomes a sense that this is the way news is, as opposed to these were decisions that were made. And these are decisions that have influenced how we think about the world around us. So I am concerned about media bias, because a lot of times, especially with news, we come at it thinking it's got to be objective, it's got to be truthful. It's human made. And so you're only going to see certain perspectives. I always remember to a time my sister was interviewed, and she was a graduate student at the time and married to a graduate student. And she had a news group that came to her and was actually recording her interview, and just said, do you feel like you guys have enough of a salary to live on? And she said, well, I'm a graduate student married to a graduate student, and it's tough. This is pretty tough, but I feel like it's fair, something along those lines. So she watched the actual news, and they cut off the second half, but I think it's fair. Because the news story that they were doing was how difficult it was for these grad students. So they took what she said, but only part of it. So I've never forgotten that particular perspective. And if you've ever had a news coverage, you've probably seen that, where you said a whole lot more, you gave a whole lot more context, and all of a sudden one quote was pulled out, and that's the quote that's given. A number of celebrities have commented on that they'll say one thing in a 2-hour interview or a 1-hour interview, and that's what gets pulled out. So I think we have to be careful about media bias and know it's being created. I think that's important. I think we have to do a lot of our own digging. One of the things I highly recommend for people is look at more than one source. For me, I will look at internet, but then my husband and I subscribe to a newspaper. And some people can say that shows your age, but I also think that there's something about newspaper coverage that is often more in depth and is owned by a different media company. So at least I'm getting a couple of different perspectives, come up from a couple of different media perspectives on that same idea. Another great thing to do, if you've got access to it, is to read news from a different country besides the United States. You'll get a very different perspective if you get a chance to do that. And I also encourage research, just actually figuring out, okay, that's what they said. Let's see if I can go back and find actual studies, or if I can find actual information.
That's good. So when you're looking at two different sources, like what are some of the things that we should see that kind of cue us to getting to the facts? Or like where do we see how it's moved from the information presented to now an interpretation of the information, et cetera?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. Some of it is really hard to discern. Some you can figure out pretty quickly. So a couple of things, in fact, my students and I do this in my classes, is we look at how media is framed. And there's a wonderful theory called agenda setting theory, which helps us to understand. It's one of the best documented theories about how media affects us. And it says that media may not change what we think, but it does change what we're thinking about. So if we're taking in that media, we're thinking about it. And for some people, it does shift how they think. And that's based on how it's framed. So look at what photo is included with it. And how is that photo framed? So in other words, what's in the foreground? Is the person looking kind of evil and dark? I mean, there's different ways to present people. Is it a flattering photo? Is it not? Are they looking powerful? Is the camera coming at them from the bottom or from the top? Those kinds of things. And I don't have time to get into all the details there, but the visuals are really important if you're looking at photos or videos. What's highlighted? Take a look at the headline. How is it presented? Is it negative toward one, or is it skewed toward one particular point of view? And then read that first paragraph. You'll usually get a quick sense of where that article's going, and you can get a better sense of it from that. So those are some of the key pieces that media uses to frame and to have us see particular perspectives.
That's good. That's super helpful. So now let's talk a little bit about confirmation bias and how we're all as a culture kind of just becoming more siloed. I don't know, but can you first describe what confirmation bias is and why we are all doing it and why we are all falling prey to it, and how we can get better at not falling into that.
Yeah, that's a super important question, because confirmation bias in some ways is just part of being human. We don't do it just with media, we do it with all sorts of things. So the idea behind confirmation bias is I already have a particular point of view, I already have a belief about something, so I look for things that will affirm my belief. And if I see something that contradicts that belief, I dismiss it, I minimize it, I argue against it. So I'm already coming in with my own bias, and that's going to impact how I see other things. The analogy that I would use is, if you've had a friend, for example, who is dating somebody and you think, man, that's probably not a good person for you to be dating. And you might bring up something and that person goes, oh, you don't really understand who this person is. Here's all the good things about them. And they minimize all the negative things. That's kind of what happens to us in some ways, is we try to justify the things that we're already connected to or already attached to. And so it's challenging. Being aware that we do it is really helpful. And I think we should always have red flags. If something causes us to bristle or causes us to get really emotionally responsive to an argument, that should be a red flag. And go, okay, why am I responding this way? What is it that feels threatening to me about this? That's one good way to take a look at it.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful. Are there any other, I guess, and so let's go here first. Our natural inclination towards confirmation bias is one piece to it. Plus, now, as you said earlier, the social media and other media agents are kind of spoon feeding us information that we had clicked on before or talked about that picked up on us. So like, how do we intentionally but how do we intentionally kind of hear opposing viewpoints, and how do we communicate through those opposing viewpoints?
Oh, that's another wonderful question, because one of the challenges with media, the way it works today, is it gets hard to find opposing viewpoints. Part of the reason for that is, and there's a great book called The Filter Bubble that explains it a bit more, but when you're doing searches, say you're using Google or a search engine, they're keeping track of what you are actually looking for. And so they start to feed you more and more of the kinds of articles and the kinds of sources that they think you're looking for. And so you begin to see more and more. Social media does this as well. So they begin to feed you a narrower and narrower set of articles or set of posts or set of links. And so more and more you're finding yourself just seeing the same kinds of things that you've already been clicking on, or that it's kind of that confirmation bias all over again. So it becomes very difficult to find. You almost have to be deliberate to go out and look for opposing viewpoints. Every once in a while, I get a direct mail piece that is completely, they mistargeted me. And it's fascinating because I actually save them and I use them in class because it's a good way for my students to go, what are they saying? I mean, you need to be exposed to this because this is how the other side, so to speak, is talking about you. And sometimes your side is talking about them, and we get this us versus them. So I think we have to actually look for it and be thoughtful and be aware that we are being fed more and more of the similar things the more that we use internet. So one way you can do it is clear your browser history. It's a good idea to do anyway, but if you're clearing your browser history regularly, you get less and less targeted. That can be one thing. I encourage you to go out and look for different opinions. I think that's a great thing to do. For one thing, you'll be less targeted, and then the other is it'll actually expose you to other opinions. I am big about listening to understand, and that's true for interpersonal communication as well as for media. If I'm listening, reading, watching to understand, I have a completely different mindset than if I'm listening, watching, reading, and preparing my defense and explaining all the reasons that's bad. Because I think the truth of the matter is most of the time, it's not like my viewpoint has all the angels on its side and my opponent's viewpoint is all evil. I mean, I'm not saying there couldn't be some of those, but a lot of the time that's not the case. There's reasons why people have the positions that they have. And I want to find out why they're there. And I want to look for common ground. I might disagree on a policy, but we might both be talking about the good of people. So now we've got a commonality we can talk about and talk more productively about.
Yeah, I think that's so important for the church to understand, because a lot of times in the articles that we're reading or the things that we're seeing in the media we're consuming, the us versus them are sitting in the pew right next to us or in the chair right next to us at church. So how do we communicate through conflict, which seems to be something that we're not as good at? And I think in part of it is this confirmation bias, media, there's a lot to it. So let's just focus on like, what are some skills, some tactics, some things that we can use to communicate through disagreements?
Yeah. So this is communication professionals around the United States, even the globe, but especially in the United States, are very concerned about this issue. And you'll hear some things about civil discourse, that we've just gotten pretty bad about disagreeing with each other without degenerating to name calling, or to saying, you know, again, that I can't believe these people are idiots or evil, or I mean, we jump to those conclusions much faster. And that's not helpful for having useful discourse. And unfortunately, that is in part a media effect. If I am face to face with somebody, I am far less likely to call them a name. I'm far less likely to say to them, you're an idiot, okay? Hopefully, if I've got good interpersonal skills, I'm not doing that. But people get behind this computer screen, or they get behind their phones, and all of a sudden it's like, I'm not interacting with a person, and I just rant and I just call people names and I do things. So that is not helping us at all. So I think we have to go back to some of those things we should have learned in kindergarten and first grade. I know it sounds basic, about things like not name calling, that we don't just fight. That's not the first thing we jump to. I love Bill Strom. He wrote a wonderful book called More Than Talk, a covenantal approach to everyday communication. And he summarizes what are some of the messages of scripture about how we can interact in productive ways. And one of the biggest ones is listen without preparing a response. So we talked a little bit about that. He also says, make understanding your aim. That's your goal, is trying to figure out this other perspective and understand it, and where it's coming from, and what's the evidence for it, and how long have you thought that, as opposed to having some other kind of aim, like I've got to prove to you I'm right, because most of the time that doesn't result in productive conversation, and people don't end up feeling we're right anyway. Respect the personhood of the person who disagrees. Respect the image of God in that person who disagrees with you. The more we can focus on the ideas as opposed to the person, the better I think we're going to do. I love an image that comes up in marriage counseling sometimes, that if there's a problem, rather than sitting across the table with each other, sit next to each other on the couch with the problem in front of you. And if we could have that idea with media, it would really help quite a bit. Is, okay, how can we as people made in God's image deal with this problem we have? That mindset is a much healthier and much more likely to end up in productive places.
So yeah, one last question, then we'll open it up to everybody else. Why, I guess, you've touched on it a lot, but why is it important for Christians to understand and come to the truth of some of the things that are being talked about in media? Why is it important? Again, just sum this all up. Why is it important for Christians to learn how to communicate through disagreements, to develop these good interpersonal skills, and to all kind of the stuff we talked about? Why is it important for Christians to really care about this?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And what I'm pulling up some statistics. I just double checked these today. They keep changing on us a little bit. But in 2018, Nielsen, which is a great, a big area in looking at how communication is used, said that the average adult spends just over 11 hours per day with media. Ouch. Yeah, most of that being the internet and television, some of it being radio, the vast majority of it being on a smartphone. A more recent study says that now that has moved to 12 hours and 9 minutes on average per day. Over 6 hours with internet, over 3 hours with television per day, over 1 hour with radio for a number of people, and about 20 minutes with print, which is actually a really interesting thing, because we take in print and we take in internet and television very differently. When people read something on a screen, if they read the exact same thing in print, they tend to read it more logically. They tend to actually think about it more critically than they do when it's on a screen, even if it's the exact same thing. We tend to jump around when we're on screens. We tend to pick it in pieces. We don't actually think through things nearly as well. So I think we have to be informed. Anything that we are doing 11 to 12 hours a day, we ought to know about. We ought to spend time getting informed about. We are doing more of that than we are doing sleeping. We're doing far more than eating. We're doing more than our jobs. I mean, it's an incredible sense. Teens are over 7 hours a day, and those between 8 and 12 are close to 5 hours per day beyond school, not counting the hours they're spending in school. These are tremendous numbers. I was recently talking with a middle school teacher, and she said a lot of her students have been turning in their work lately at 1 or 2 in the morning, middle schoolers. So our sleep is getting affected. Our posture is getting affected. Our physical bodies are getting affected. Our spirits are getting affected. We are spending so much time. It is absolutely crucial that we understand what it's doing to us. And in my opinion, I think we're in the age of media gluttony. And I think we need to pull back. I am certainly not alone in that. The biggest warnings coming out on media are coming out of the medical and psychological communities, who are arguing we are seeing more depression, more anxiety, higher suicide rates. We are seeing a number of challenges, in part because we are spending so much time on media and so little time in true good fellowship, in exercise, in getting outside. I am concerned, and I'm certainly not alone with what's happening. And I believe anybody who is a Christian should be concerned about what's happening to our physical bodies, our personhood, the way we're interacting with each other. I think it's too big. We've got to be able to pay attention to it.
That's good. Thank you for sharing all that. Let's open it up. Anybody have some questions they want to ask? John?
Yeah, I was going to ask about media is kind of getting, with the internet, obviously, increasingly sort of decentralized. You talked about sort of the big companies, and increasingly there's a lot more kind of grassroots media happening as well. Mm-hmm. And I feel sometimes sort of stuck because I see as you said, there's these big companies that have a profit motive that control a lot of the narrative in terms of like the bigger media companies. And then on the other side, there's blogs and things that it's really hard to see where they're getting information from and sourcing and things like that. So it feels like neither is a great option all the time in terms of actually finding reliable information that's just delivering the facts. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or about combing through that stuff.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think it's challenging because the vast majority of our media is coming from these oligopolies, so these, your CNNs, your NBCs, CBS, and so that can be challenging. And you're right. I think we have to be careful with grassroots. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think one of the beauties of internet is you can end up with a worldwide audience just from your bedroom as you're typing away on those. And so some of these people have really important things to say, and there have been some great movements that have happened because we have the option for the average person to get there and not be turned off by an editor or by one of the big companies. So again, to me, I do a lot of wide reading. I spend a lot of time in the academy, so I read a lot of studies that are done. I read a lot of experiments, and I read a lot of people that I respect their opinions, but it took me a while to get there. So I agree with you. I think it's challenging, but I think the wider we cast our net, the more that we read this and this, we begin to see, oh, I'm seeing a pattern here. This, and I'm seeing it in multiple places. That's probably something that actually is happening. I know it's not a great answer because I do think it's challenging. In fact, if a few of the things I'm saying, you're like, I never heard about this. Part of it is because media doesn't have a strong desire to get us off media. So they're probably not going to report a lot on some of the really negative things that are happening. So it is a challenge. I wish I had a better, say this is the pure one, but I'm not sure there is such a thing.
For sure.
The other piece that we haven't talked about is how much public relations is actually part of news. Minimum, probably about 40% of what we are getting is coming from corporations themselves, PR, and especially as the news personnel shrink, reporters shrink, more and more is coming actually from companies trying to push their own agendas. So that's not great news either. So
the one other question that I thought of as you were talking is you've observed kind of the shifts in media with social media. kind of alongside just your observations about the Christian kind of the faith community of Christians, as platform building has sort of become more of a thing and more of a thing for Christian leaders, pastors, thinkers as well. What shifts have you seen in sort of the behavior of Christian followership that have come with that?
Yeah. At one level, again, I think you see some amazing things where, and I know a lot of churches even now have gotten more followers and more people are attending our virtual services than were coming in person. And that's, it's exciting that we can reach people that we couldn't reach. And there are places in the world where the message is not going to get out if it doesn't get out potentially virtually. So that, I think, is a great thing. I think we always have to be careful, and I think this is true in Christian music, I think this is true in Christian radio, et cetera, that we just take all the celebrity culture and we just import it into Christianity. And so now everybody wants to follow this person or gets excited about this, and it becomes about that person or that brand. Here's the branding of our church. I think we do have to be very careful that we don't just slide right into the same things. We just kind of secularized the church or taken secular models and made it into there. I think we have to be prayerful, thoughtful. I think we need to be open to critique on these things because it's just so easy to just take the models people are used to. Consumer church. I go someplace because it entertains me. And as soon as it stops entertaining me or it gets tough, I go to a different church. I think we have to be careful about some of those, getting that kind of mentality instead of a disciple of Jesus mentality.
Awesome. Does anyone else have questions? Go ahead, Bevan.
Yeah, I have a question for you around some practical things you have either shared with your students or heard from your students in regards to ways to try to manage media consumption. We hear terms sometimes like, hey, I'm going to go on a Facebook fast, or I'm going to go on a media fast, and they apply those. And I've seen that. Have you seen others? And curious what kind of tools and techniques you think you've shared.
Yeah. So one of the things I have my students do is keep a journal of their media use and write down everything. And so we do that for 5 days. And I tell them, don't let yourself off the hook. If it's 5 minutes on this, keep track of it. And that actually is really eye-opening to a lot of them, is they didn't realize how much time they were spending. And there's some of my students are using their phones to track their time. I've got a couple of students who've used one that when they reach a certain limit, it just shuts their phone off and they can't go other places. And I'm like, oh, okay, I guess I've reached my limit for today. So I think that's interesting. Others of them have the ones that track how often they look, because they realize they're compulsively looking at their phones. That's not an unusual thing today. And so they're like, wow, I'm up to 583. Maybe that's too many times today. So actually there's some interesting things in the mediums themselves that if we take advantage of them, they can help us monitor ourselves. So I think that can be really useful, is to think through, do I need to set a timer? I often will set a timer on my phone because I spend a lot of time writing or looking at a screen, and every 20 minutes, you may be aware you're supposed to take a break and have at least 20 seconds where you're looking off 20 feet. So the 20-20-20 rule. Boy, it's really easy for me to forget. I can get into 2 hours on my screen without really taking a break if I'm not careful. So I'll set timers. And then I'll tell my son too, I'm like, okay, walk around, So I think we have to be thoughtful in so many ways. One of the biggest ones we haven't really talked a lot about is the physical impacts of our media usage. And those are honestly some of the scarier ones for me. So nearsightedness has gone up. It's doubled in the United States since the 1970s. It is at an extremely high percentage in a number of Asian countries. Europe, the younger generation has twice as much nearsightedness as the people in their 40s to 60s right now. So we know our eyes are getting impacted by it. We're getting hearing loss at extremely young ages. So stuff that we didn't see until people reach their 70s, it's hitting them in their 30s now. So there's a number of things that I really believe we have to be thoughtful and teach people discipline. Because a lot of times we don't have discipline. I like the idea of fasting. I think it's a good thing, as long as we don't end that fast and then go right back to 11 hours or 12 hours of mass media use and think that's a normal thing for our bodies and our minds and our spirits to do.
Bev, you had a question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think I'm on the minority of the spectrum here in a lot of ways, but so I'm kind of like the blue collar, 100 hours a week kind of guy, and so I got to fight for kind of all the media I get. You know, I don't mean this too strictly, but I just don't care a lot. But like, you know, so how important is it that I reach out and find good media, or like, am I okay just getting the stuff that filters in, or like talking to my friends, or like, should I be reaching out to find something great, or should I like be comfortable in the simplicity of it?
That is a great question. So you're just a minimal media user, right?
Correct. Yeah,
Yeah.
and yeah, more just busy with other stuff, not yeah.
Keep it up. You know? um, I think that's great. I really do. I don't feel like you should find ways to get more media into your life unless you feel led to do so. There are an awful lot of benefits. We do. Honestly, I really do. I think we're gorging as a culture, and I'm glad that there's some people who are not gorging along with everybody else, because a lot happens in those moments when we allow ourselves to be silent, or we go out and take a walk or a bike ride or run. There's some things we're losing. So I would say if you're not feeling a need for it, and nobody's saying, wow, you know, you refuse to learn how to turn on a smartphone, you know, as long as you're kind of not in that category, I think you're fine. I wouldn't necessarily encourage you to do more. We've gone an awful lot of centuries without this stuff and done some pretty cool things. So you may have heard that a lot of like Steve Jobs and a lot of the folks out in Silicon Valley have historically not let their kids be on much media, because they said, we want to build their innovation and imagination, and media is not the way to do it. So I'm far more worried about people using too much media than using too little.
Any other questions, guys?
I have one more. Pull it up here. So I was just thinking about how I think a lot of times media, it seems like they want to funnel things into a clear, simple, consistent story, and it just doesn't always represent the relative complication or chaos of the world. As we've been going through this conference, my takeaway all the time is like, man, this is a lot more complicated than I think. You know what I mean? And so I don't know what it is in our brains that desires that simplicity or that reason or whatever it is. But anything you'd say about just being aware of that or looking out for that, or?
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the big dangers of taking in a lot of media, especially if you're taking it in over the internet or social media, is it's training us to think in very small bursts. If I can't understand it in a few seconds, I move on to something more fun. You know, I think we are in danger of not having people, I think we're training people not to think deeply. I think we're training people not to think well. I think we're not helping people to see how many perspectives are out there. So if you take something like poverty, there's not just a Democratic and a Republican, there's lots of views, and they may not be Democratic or Republican at all. And you have all sorts of different Democrats and all sorts of different Republicans, and you've got libertarians, you've got all these different ideas. You have many different types of perspectives, and media is generally not very good about representing multiple perspectives. They generally take two. And so we begin to see things as, oh, well, there must be just two sides to this. When in reality is most issues are far more complicated. We need much more backstory, more context, instead of people reading something quickly and then forming an opinion and then arguing loudly for that opinion without actually having taken the time to really understand the nuances. It is a danger of media use, and the more your media use goes up, the more likely you are to simplify complex issues.
I have a follow-up to that, I guess. Like, is there research, or that binary nature of things, is that more due to human condition, or is it something that media has kind of just pushed on us as a culture? Both? What's percentage there? I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, I think, honestly, I think it's a lot of it is the media effect, is that we start to think of things in two ways. Because honestly, if you read deeply in books, if you kind of spend a lot of time, like a documentary or anything that will go in depth for you, you're going to get multiple perspectives. You're going to get lots of different ways of thinking about things. And so I really do think it's to simplify, to get it into that 30-minute broadcast or to get it into that quick thing. We just decide it's these versus this. So I do think there's a big media effect. Now, of course, our brains like to simplify things. We simplify things into stories. We simplify things into scaffolding we can understand. But I don't think there's anything magical about the two-part. Our brains take in 3-part pretty well. They take in 4-part. They take in 5-part. Once you start to get into 6-part, it gets a little harder for us to hold it all there. But we can certainly take in more than 2. So I don't think that there's anything inherently about our brains that makes us go to 2, but we do if we spend a lot of time with media. That's what we'll start to think of.